Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Icarus, and today we're continuing to go over Whipping Girl by Julia Serrano. If you've not seen the other two parts, part 1 goes over the introduction and the Trans Woman Manifesto. Part 2 goes over chapter 1. We are going chapter by chapter because I'm just way too long-winded to not go by this format. So, today's chapter is going over how trans women are depicted in media, and just like with before, I want to give my usual disclaimer. This is my opinion. I am coming from a place of bias because I'm looking at this as a trans man from about 15 years in the future of when this was written. Julia Serrano grew up in a vastly different time than I did. When this book was published, I wasn't even aware of what transgender meant, so we have to keep that in mind. That said, I do think because this book is still heavily referenced and used today, especially currently, to try and combat the idea that trans men can coin terminology and discuss their issues, it's important to read and understand what the source material is saying, and that's what this is about. So, as usual, I'm going to read my notes from the conclusion, and then we're going to go back through the chapter, and I will read my thoughts and my notes and try to give you the context of what I was reading when I was reading the chapter initially. So, without further ado, here we go. Alright, chapter 2 notes. There's a lot to unpack here, and we're only 2 chapters in. Serrano and I have vastly different theories about why trans women are overrepresented in media and in such a hyper-feminized way. Admittedly, I am reading this from about 15-17 years in the future, from when it was written / when it was published. So there's definitely been a positive uptick in trans women representation since this was published. The fact that trans women are hyper-feminized is a problem, but Serrano spends an excessive amount of time overreading and hating on Transamerica. This is a movie that we'll go into more in depth in a moment. I believe Transamerica is actually a pretty damn good film for its time and even past that. The problem now lies more in the fact that the public eye is so heavily on trans women, and people are trying to wrap their heads around it, or claiming they're trying. So having a tomboy woman who happens to be trans would be considered an invalidation of the argument in conservative minds, proof that trans women are faking, which is a problem all of its own, and it is addressed briefly in this chapter as well, but not nearly as much as the hyperfeminization, which I believe is in part from Serrano's own relationship with femininity, because she herself has said she doesn't particularly present high femme. I'm also uncomfortable with how much Serrano plays down trans men in this as well, especially with the Raymond piece. Again, we'll be getting into that. I'm very lucky that my source for this book also pointed out that she was straight up lying about Raymond's information, and I question if hypersexualizing trans women is indeed because of downplaying trans men. I question it, but I also just disagree with it. There's a lot of understandable anger here, but hostility towards non-binary, gender non-conforming, trans mask, AFAB people feels weird. Well, I don't like the early TERF festival being mentioned, and I'm not certain I'd like or agree with the she-he performer the one article talked about. Serrano manages to play lip service to trans men before justifying her own lack of wanting to dress up while she's still called a bitch. It's understandable, but it's also weird and upsetting. There's a lot of context that we need to go into, which is what we're about to do. So chapter 2 is Skirt Chasers, why the media depicts the trans revolution in lipstick and heels. She starts out talking about how she is constantly told that she can never be a real woman, and that there's more to womanhood than putting on a dress. She's like, I agree, it's frustrating because I rarely wear makeup or dress in an overly feminine manner. So again, self-described, she does not choose to dress up in an overly femme way, and she's still a woman. So we can both agree on that. But I think this is where some of the irritation of these more feminine representations does great at her. We'll tip down to the trans woman archetypes in media, and this is where the deceptive transsexual or pathetic transsexual depictions comes from. You'll hear this as talking points in other terms. I saw this very recently while talking about trans men and trans women in media. The idea is the deceptive transsexual is someone who does pass very well, and their gender identity is revealed as a shocking moment, like they have tricked a heteronormative man into being attracted to them. And the pathetic transsexual is the stereotype of a man in a dress with stubble, they can't pass, that sort of thing. So that's pretty much that. There is going into different movies that were out at the time. Ace Ventura is a great one. There's something about a 1970 film adaptation of a novel where the protagonist is a trans woman who takes revenge on manhood, which, you know, it's a gross premise, and it's not how, I hesitate to say this, but some of the attitudes that I've seen online does feel very in line with how this 1970 film adaptation shows a woman choosing to take revenge against the patriarchy through raping masculine men with a strap-on dildo. And is listed in here as a negative example of a trans woman, and I agree, it's a negative example, but I also feel like this attitude of revenge is becoming more and more commonplace in feminism because of radfem rhetoric. So I end up going through all of that, and I write at the end, it's interesting to see here how Serrano speaks of poorly passing trans women in media being seen as harmless while the deceivers are in danger. I can't help but think about how people like Blair White are ultra femme in an attempt to be seen as harmless, and equally femme Natalie Wynn is a spokesperson to the moderate right. But the poorly passing trans women are supposed to be a threat to women at large. So to unpack what I'm saying there, Serrano is saying that the deceivers, the people who pass very, very well, are the dangerous ones in media coming out around this time. And I do agree with her, that's how it was presented. While the poorly dressed, poorly disguised trans women are the ones that are harmless. But nowadays it feels very reversed, because you will have people like Blair White be very vocal conservative. And yes, she has been chewed out by right-wing women, but that is one of those examples of a cis woman having power over a trans woman and using it to get at them. And meanwhile, you have the stereotype of a man in a dress being the ones that are depicted as dangerous while they're also pathetic. Natalie Wynn is known as someone who can help middling to almost right-leaning people step back from their phobias and realize, oh, I was wrong. And that's all very good, but I feel like if she did not transition and transitioned into such a gorgeous looking person, then we wouldn't be having that same sort of influence. But, you know, opinions. That's my opinion, and I could be proven wrong in the future. We keep going, talking about a pathetic transsexual's lighthearted comments about having penis chopped off, and meanwhile the deceivers, it's usually a shock that they have one. Then highlighted, I wrote, a Freudian might suggest that the deceptive transsexual's dangerous nature is symbolized by the presence of a hidden penis, while the pathetic transsexual's harmlessness is due to a lack thereof. And I write, feels less Freudian and more a fact. TERFs in particular become very bioessentialist in that it's the dick that produces the T that makes things so bad, while TERFs, with an I, trans-inclusive radical feminist, and Bedels seem more about the mouthfeel variety, where essentially what I'm saying here is TERFs, the traditional TERFs that we're familiar with, see the penis as the inherent danger. And I'm also including lesbian separatists, radfems who hate men, that sort of thing into this. Because, let's face it, these are also TERFs. They're all under this umbrella term. While trans-inclusive radical feminists and Bedels seem to take pride in having their penis and being different, being a trans woman, putting the emphasis on being a trans woman over anything else. I feel a little heated about that because I don't know how the discussions were being had in 2007. What I do know is what I see today. And what I see today is almost a contradiction of these stereotypes and media presentations, though it also depends on what you're looking at. And at the end of the day, I'm looking at both people who generally hate trans people and the trans community who are actively using this book to silence trans men. On to the next section, called the Fascination with Feminization. Alright, so we now get to the next section, which is the Fascination with Feminization. And this is where the critique about Transamerica comes up. I actually stopped reading her book and I went and watched Transamerica because while I do agree with her about the depictions of trans people in the other films, I was curious as this was a film made in 2005 and I wanted to see what did and did not align with her critique because it felt very harsh even without knowing what was going on. So I've brought up the Wikipedia article to make sure I'm saying things right. Like I said, it was made in 2005. It's an American comedy drama. The writer-director is not a very big name at all. It did star Felicity Huffman as the trans woman, which in that time was kind of a big deal because before trans women were usually depicted by cis men. The actual movie is about a trans woman who goes by Bree. She has cut off her past, doesn't talk to her parents, doesn't acknowledge her former name, that sort of thing. She has been on hormone therapy for 3 years. She has done multiple surgeries. She has gone through everything. The very last thing she needs to feel complete is bottom surgery. She gets permission from her therapist. The doctor gives the go-ahead so long as she gets the letter. And then she gets a phone call from her past. Unbeknownst to her, she had a son, and he is now 17. She tries to block him out, but the therapist refuses to give her the letter unless she goes to gain some sort of closure over her past life. This leads Bree going from LA to New York to get Toby out, who is her son. She does not tell him that he is her son, and through a variety of reasons, they end up on a road trip together. It's an extremely back and forth movie. I really enjoyed it because Bree, the entire time, was being treated like a woman. Her gender identity came up a few times, but it was in fairly understandable ways. So she travels with Toby, and she first tries to drop him off at his stepfather's house, but it turns out Toby ran away from home because his stepfather was very sexually abusive to him, and Toby himself, I need to mention, is gay, or at least bisexual. He has a dream of eventually going to LA, dyeing his hair, changing his name to Stanley, and being a porn star. He does get to that dream, but it's a very simple dream, and he was in drugs. It's basically what you would expect. As someone who was born to a single mother, who then married someone who became a stepfather, and then his mother committed suicide, abusive relationship, ran away from home. Bree drags him back, discovers what happened, and decides, you know what, I'm going to take you to LA. I need to be in LA by this date because I have reasons. She's pretending to be a missionary, and she has not come out to Toby, let alone let Toby know that she is his father. And they continue on. They meet a really nice dude who obviously is crushing hard on Bree, and I am here for it. Great man, good taste in woman. They also meet a weird spiritualist who steals their car. I'll be honest, Bree's gender identity does come up a couple of times. First, Bree is accidentally outed to Toby when she goes to the bathroom on the side of the road. She couldn't hold it. He accidentally caught a glimpse. Learns. He lashes out not because of her gender identity. That was definitely a shock for him. But he lashes out because he was surprised and hurt that she lied to him. This is after she already lied and tried to set him back home with the stepfather who abused him. And she agreed to take him to LA afterwards. He'd already been lied to once, and discovering this as a shock, he lashes out, and he lashes out in a very bad way. He accuses her of being a man and lying, and it's extremely hurtful. And things don't get readily resolved, but they do get resolved. He ends up admitting that, yes, he sees her as a woman. It's that. He accepts her, I don't think he ever really apologizes, but it's one of those situations where the actions speak louder than words. They also end up staying the night with a bunch of other trans women who are activists. Now, this is very notable. Bree is not an activist. She is not out about her identity, and that's totally within her right. She is very uncomfortable with the idea of being seen as a trans woman. So when she's there and when Toby is being accepted and enjoying the time with these women and one trans man who was a fantastic person, I loved him. He was fucking around with tarot cards, and that's great. I'm here for him. She kind of gets called out a little bit, and interesting stuff comes up about like trans culture at the time, where she tries to clock a woman as being trans, not passing. Turns out that that woman is cis. But all of that's actually a subject for a different day, and that would go more into my understanding of how trans woman culture is through Natalie Wynn's videos. So we'll leave that alone. I may try and find the one video I'm talking about and link it, but that's not a promise. The second time her gender identity really comes up as a problem is when she goes meet her parents, because she does stop to get some money to get the rest of the way home. And that ends up being a whole thing because her parents don't accept her until like the very end, where they do start calling her Bree. Her sister is a druggie who is just like, hey, glad you're back because now I'm no longer the black sheep right now, that sort of deal. It's all very complicated, and it feels like it's handled in a very realistic way. Around that time, also, when they're at the parents' house, it comes out that Bree is indeed Toby's father. He runs away. She gets a flight home, gets to her surgery. After the surgery, the therapist comes in and is like, hey, this is great, right? And she breaks down sobbing because she's upset about how things got left with Toby. Life slowly moves on. The movie ends with Toby coming to see her. He is part of a new porn that he actually brings the advertisement to her for. It's like, hey, look at this. I made it. And it ends with them settling and talking, and things look like it might move forward. It's an extremely touching, lovely. This was made in 2005, and somehow this movie feels realistic. It feels like something that would come from a trans person, and I don't know the whole history behind it, and it has its problems. It was made in 2005. This movie about a trans woman rang true to me as a trans man. It has these complications that I recognize in my own family and in my own experience as coming out and trying to pass and trying to be who I want to be. So then I go back to Serrano's work, and I'm reading it, and she is just tearing into how it looks like it's fetishizing the hyperfemininity, and it does focus at the very introduction of the whole thing. It goes through her getting ready for the day, wearing all pink, that sort of thing, hiding her Adam's apple, trying to not appear so much taller than a man at the bus stop, that sort of thing. And she just tears into it. And I wrote this note. Okay, I'm watching Transamerica because I'm very curious about it. And so far, while there is a focus on the dressing of aspect of things, this is within the first 10 minutes, there's some very cutting commentary in just the first few minutes about how gender dysphoria is a serious mental illness. And isn't it funny how plastic surgery can fix a serious mental illness? Like, the entire thing validates her identity over and over and over again, and validates her choice in her way of transitioning. I end up writing, what the fuck is wrong with you, Serrano? This movie does none of the shit you're saying, and is a fucking gorgeous attempt to look into the reality of being trans in 2005. Because she wrote, feminine apparel and cosmetics are repeatedly used as a device to highlight Bree's fakeness. There are excessive scenes in which Bree is shown in the act of dressing and undressing, as though her clothing represented some kind of costume. We also see her applying and fixing her makeup nearly every chance she gets, and it's difficult not to view the thick layers of foundation she constantly wears as a mask that is hiding the real, undoubtedly more masculine, Brie underneath. Then talking about how there is foundation developing a sheen, stumbles in high heels on more than one occasion, etc., etc. Felicity Hoffman comes off as much more contrived than several real-life trans women, and I write, she appears contrived because she's been forced into a situation which she is uniquely unprepared for and did not even want to be in. As, again, she wanted to ignore her son, who was in jail. His bond was like $1, by the way. That I found hilarious, because he was found stealing a frog and happened to have some drugs on him. This is another reason why I have so much doubt with this book, because this movie was so much more than that. And she is so willing to tear into it and see all of those hurtful things in it. And meanwhile, I'm watching it, and I'm watching the opening scene where she's getting ready, and I'm just seeing Legally Blonde, but with a very insecure woman who wants so badly to be seen as cis that she is willing to throw her sisters under the bus at any moment and hates being around them. And it's completely understandable. Not everyone wants to be out and proud. Not everyone needs to be out and proud about it. Some people just need the chance to recover and be themselves. It's so disingenuous, and this is also coming at a time. Again, Legally Blonde was in 2001. This was coming in a time where femininity was trying to be embraced again, where you could love the color pink and dressing up and being girly, but also still be an incredibly competent, smart person. But yeah, I just find the every bit about her critique of Transamerica feels hollow to me. I can understand where she's coming from as someone who is not feminine herself necessarily, in like the girly stereotypical way. But if you read this book and you don't look into anything else, you are really doing yourself a disservice. We then go into this talking about how this article from the New York Times in 2004 called "As Repression Eases, More Iranians Change Their Sex." It's not sensationalistic. It describes the rise of transsexual rights in Iran. And then she complains about 2 pictures on there. That's no longer on there, by the way, because I looked it up, and I'm going to read a little bit from it to you. But it's describing how you see trans women putting on makeup. You see 2 women putting on makeup, that sort of thing. For me, I read through this article because I could actually find it online. And it is just... I'm going to read just from the middle. One early campaigner for transsexual rights is Mariam Hatun Mokhara, who was formerly a man known as Faridun. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing it. I couldn't find a way to look up the pronunciation online. Before the revolution, under the Shah, he had longed to become a woman but could not afford surgery. Furthermore, he wanted religious guidance. In 1978, he wrote to Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, who was to become the leader of the revolution but was still in exile, explaining his situation. The Ayatollah replied that his case was different from that of a homosexual and therefore he had his blessing. So that is just one small chunk. This article is referring to, in this case, one person, Mariam, who is a trans woman, and the entire time refers to her with male pronouns, and continues to refer to her and other trans women with male pronouns. The only person that they use the correct pronouns with is actually a trans man named Amir. That's weird. And what's really weird is she's like going to dunk and deride on Transamerica. But this article, she's just like, this article's great, minus these 2 pictures. Sure. Okay, so let's go to my next little highlighted section. Mass media images of biological males dressing and acting in a feminine manner could potentially challenge mainstream notions of gender, but the way they are generally presented in these feminization scenes ensures that this never happens. The media neutralizes the potential threat that trans femininities pose to the category of women by playing to the audience's subconscious belief that femininity itself is artificial. After all, while most people assume that women are naturally feminine, they also, rather hypocritically, require them to spend an hour or two each day putting on their faces and getting all dressed up in order to meet societal standards for femininity, unlike men, whose masculinity is presumed to come directly from who he is and what he does. Skipping a little down, we go to further, by focusing on the most feminine of artifices, the media evokes the idea that trans women are living out some sort of sexual fetish. Sexual fetish being autogynephilia. We've gone over it before. It's a bullshit thing. So this is where I mentioned the thing about 2001's Legally Blonde. There is a lot of injustice in the fact that women are pressured to dress up while men are pressured to be authentic by doing nothing. But even the article you link mentions a woman constantly adjusting her hair, as well as the misgendering. And thinking about this, rereading it a couple of days later, I also disagree with what I wrote here. I do agree with the idea that it is unfair for women to be forced to dress up for expectations. Women getting sent home or being ridiculed from work because they didn't put on makeup, that's dumb as hell. Women should be allowed to put on makeup if they want to or not. So should men. So should trans people, etc., etc. Makeup should just be a choice. It shouldn't be demanded. However, there is expectations for manhood too. Like, you are expected to be fit, masculine, rugged. There are some variations thereof, but just look at how few choices men have to dress versus how many choices women can have. There's still a role that men are expected to play. It just happens that that role seems to look more natural than what women are expected to. I also mentioned somewhere that she must really hate the TV show Pose, because that whole thing, there's a whole lot of dressing up. It goes back to the drag days in, I believe, the 80s, and it's so good. Plus, it's a great look at black and brown people as trans and queer communities. It's good. I can get into that. I'm trying not to because I already went too hard into Transamerica. We're going to scoot down to the media's transgender gap, where there is most certainly a connection between the differing values given to women and men in our culture, true, and the media's fascination with depicting trans women rather than trans men, who were born female but identify as male. Going past the nuance of we no longer state that trans men are necessarily born female but see themselves as male, this is where our disconnect on why trans women are focused so much. And there's this whole thing about this guy in 1994, he decided to talk about civil rights protections in terms of gender identity, and he was outside the courthouse, and people kept looking for the trans woman who wrote it, and he was like, no, I did it. And because he looked normal, he wasn't really noteworthy. And there is indeed the media tends not to notice or to outright ignore trans men because they are unable to sensationalize them the way they do trans women without bringing masculinity itself into question. I do agree with that to a limit. I also think it's just easier to fearmonger trans women. And because trans women get so much backlash, it then becomes more important to the trans community to highlight their voices, make them heard. And then we go into this cycle of, because trans women are being positively represented, they must be pushed back harder by people, and political stuff gets back, and then we have to push harder for their voices to be heard, and it's just a never-ending cycle. Skipping down to the last bit, this is why trans women like myself, who rarely dress in an overly feminine manner, and or who are not attracted to men, are such an enigma to many people. By assuming that my desire to be female is merely some sort of femininity fetish or sexual perversion, they are essentially making the case that women have no worth beyond the extent to which they can be sexualized. I'm highlighting this because, again, I think this idea of her not being the stereotypical feminine person is bleeding into her dislike of feminine portrayals of trans women, especially because there's so few portrayals of more butch trans women. But especially in today's day and age, it feels like women-loving women, trans women, are way more seen than maybe straight trans women or stuff like that. So it's a whole thing. Like, it's probably just a difference of how media has been portraying women since 2005. So we move on to feminist depictions of trans women. So, the trans women that should be positive. Trans women foster sexism by mimicking patriarchal attitudes about femininity, or that we objectify women by trying to possess female bodies of our own. So this is in reference to how other feminists might see trans women. And this actually is where we get into Janice G. Raymond's 1975 book, The Transsexual Empire, The Making of the She-Male, and it is, according to Serrano at the time, perhaps the most influential feminist writing on transsexuals. Like the media, Raymond virtually ignores trans men, dismissing them as tokens, and instead focuses almost exclusively on trans women, insisting that they transition in order to achieve stereotypical femininity. Before we get into why that's incorrect, I want to let you know who Janice Raymond is. She is a feminist who was born in 1953. She is an American lesbian rad femme. Who is surprised? While she has done work on the whole sex trafficking, she's probably a swerfed, if I'm honest. She has also written this horrible book that essentially says, and I'm going to quote this from Wikipedia, Raymond maintains that transsexualism is based on the patriarchal myths of male mothering and making of woman according to man's image. She claims this is done in order to colonialize feminist identification, culture, politics, and sexuality, adding, all transsexuals rape women's bodies by reducing the real female form to an artifact, appropriating this body for themselves. Transsexuals merely cut off the most obvious means of invading women, so that they seem non-invasive. And yes, she is a white woman who was born in 1943. As far as I can tell, she's still alive, which is upsetting in its own right, but we're not going to get into that. Raymond is playing into the deceiver or pathetic role, where the pathetic, harmless ones are the ones that cut their dick off, whereas the deceiver is the one that keeps their dicks, which plays into modern turfdom and is playing into Serrano's narrative as well. However, let's talk about what Serrano just said that Raymond has said about trans men. And I got this from Trans Gentleman Luke. I will link his specific excerpt down in the link below. And he says, however, Raymond does talk about trans men and definitely does not dismiss them as tokens. In fact, she actually compares trans men to coming out as a final solution of women, in which the final solution is a reference to Hitler's genocide of the Jews in World War II. Raymond fully suggests that trans men coming out is a genocide against women. And I agree with them, that is not tokenization. And then I went and highlighted, to emphasize this, she refers to trans women as male to constructed females and addresses them with masculine pronouns throughout the book. And I highlighted that to again go back to that New York Times article where they frequently refer to trans women with masculine pronouns. Please, someone tell me how that makes sense. Raymond hypersexualizes them by playing down the existence of trans people who transition to male. Well, not only does that make sense because we just heard that Raymond saying trans men is genociding women, but I don't understand how downplaying trans men hypersexualizes trans women. That is not a connection I have made in reading any of her work. So, if someone can please explain what the fuck she's talking about, that would be great. I then add a note where she's continuing to dunk on Raymond, and that's understandable. Just looking at Wikipedia's sources, which are a great starting point for anything, it looks like around 2003 to 2007, it was a very popular time to start denouncing and critiquing Raymond's work. So, yeah, we're just going to go past this because we know the transsexual empire is insanely stupid and should not be talked about. Though, the transsexual empire is a very good launching off point to talk about lesbian separatism, rad femme politics, man-hating, that sort of thing, because then she goes into the Michigan Women's Music Festival, simply referred to as Michigan, which is a women-born women, without the A, mind you, it's replaced with a Y, that prevents trans women from attending. However, it does allow trans men and AFAB people who don't identify as women to attend, and she has issues with that. Which, Yes, it's understandable. Have issues with it. I have issues with it too. But it feels like she's once again placing non binary, gender non conforming, and trans men underneath her ridicule. And she writes, so penises are banned from the festival, right? Because they don't want trans women in, and a lot of trans women still have their penises due to how expensive it can be, or they just choose to keep their penises. It's well within their right. But she continues, well, not quite. The festival does allow women to purchase and use dildos, strap ons, and packing devices, many of which closely resemble penises. So phalluses, in and of themselves, are not so bad, just so long as they're not attached to a trans woman. Or a man, but Serrano doesn't really care about that. These are women-only spaces, women with a Y, after all, and I question why she would want to be part of these spaces, but you know. Let's see, going on, I did try to look up some of this allowing trans men and non-binary people into these roles, and I had mentioned it in my overview. I'm not going to get too into it. Basically, from what I could tell, this is turf territory. It's gross. Moving on down, she talks about her own experience in transitioning. She writes, actually, most of us are only a hormone prescription away from being perceived as the opposite sex, which is fundamentally untrue. Why else would trans women have such issues? And Natalie Wynn, as much as I don't like her later work, she does discuss at one point how she ended up worsening her own gender dysphoria from looking at websites and criticizing each and every single perceived imperfection in herself, and how harmful this thing of passing could be. It's probably also why I look at Transamerica and Bree's issues with her own gender, and I don't see negativity with that. I see a woman who's hurting. But that's the end of it. She ends it talking about her transition and how easy it is to transition from one sex to the other. And all in all, this chapter is hard. Not only does she completely misquote and misrepresent a horrible person's language towards trans men, but she throws people who choose, for one reason or another, to enter these rad femme lesbian separatist spaces while not identifying as women under the bus. Like, they're not good people. I don't think they're good people for going to these events, because clearly they agree with some of the underlying ideology. But it's still kind of gross. And the fact that she says the phalluses attached to trans women are the only thing not allowed is like, no, they see you as men, and men aren't allowed. That's its own complete issue. It's not about the strap-ons and the dildos. It's the fact that they fundamentally don't recognize you as who you are. And then just, I think, even beyond the complete misrepresentation of Raymond's work, I'm most upset about how she treated Transamerica. And I do recommend people watch it if you're able, because it's heartbreaking in many moments, but overall, it never denies her gender identity. It never fetishizes her. It has a critique about how her doctor is treating her. And it ends on a very hopeful note. And considering how much trauma porn there is for trans and gay people out there, I think that's a good thing. But I've already been rattling on long enough. I'm going to end it here. Probably not going to do another in-depth look tomorrow. I want to try and dedicate the day mostly to writing. But we'll do something fun, I promise. And y'all stay hydrated, stay safe, and I'll talk to y'all tomorrow. Bye.